George VI, he was desperate to ensure that the influx of aid from the United States, on which Britain's fighting capacity depended, does not suffer more than is, I fear, inevitable. His fears were exacerbated when, on the night of December the 7th, the US Army and Navy stopped all defense aid shipments to foreign governments to ensure that sufficient supplies were available for America's own war in the Pacific. From Washington, the British ambassador, Lord Halifax, warned Churchill that Roosevelt was reluctant to agree to his visit. The American public, Halifax said, was now focused on Japan.
Worse, many Americans remained unconvinced that the United States needed to entangle itself in an additional conflict with the German Reich.
Indeed, Senator Vandenberg himself wrote in his diary on December the 8th that although he and his fellow non-interventionists were now ready to go along with war against Japan, they remained wedded to our beliefs.
They showed little sign of embracing a wider war.
President Franklin Roosevelt was well aware of the national mood. Roosevelt had spent more than a year carefully educating his fellow countrymen about the threat posed by Hitler's Germany.
He had established the United States as the arsenal of democracy, providing as much aid as was politically feasible to the Allied nations fighting Hitler.
While Roosevelt prioritized Europe, he had evinced comparatively less concern about Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. But now, on December the 7th, 1941, the United States found itself at war not with Nazi Germany, against whom Roosevelt had devoted so many American resources, but with Imperial Japan. An immediate declaration of war on Hitler was a tremendous political risk at a time when the nation's attention and anger were directed against Japan. Cables from Berlin to Tokyo, intercepted and decoded by US intelligence, suggested that Germany would join any war that Japan fought against the United States. But Hitler's behavior was not so easy to predict. As Roosevelt's speechwriter Robert Sherwood later noted, the Nazis were in honor bound by their pledges to the Japanese, but they had not previously shown much inclination to let such bourgeois democratic considerations interfere with their own concepts on self-interest. Japan's leadership was no more certain that Hitler would keep his word. Emperor Hirohito and other members of the Japanese elite had repeatedly expressed their fear that Hitler, who had previously described the Japanese as a second-class race, would reconcile with the other white powers, the Anglo-Saxon United States and British Empire, leaving Japan to fight alone.
There was indeed considerable ambivalence in Berlin about helping to bring down the so-called White British Empire, even though Hitler had increasingly reshaped himself as the defender of those he terms the global have-nots against the Anglo-Saxon haves as the war progressed.
Moreover, Hitler was being advised that as Japan had initiated the conflict with the United States, Germany was under no obligation to support its ally by joining in a declaration of war. German diplomats made their leader aware that Roosevelt was determined to avoid simultaneous hostilities in the Pacific and Atlantic, and had no intention of issuing a declaration against Germany. If Germany avoided a formal state of war with the United States, then, with America's attention fixed on Japan, Britain might be deprived of any further meaningful support from Washington, and left isolated against the Axis powers in the Atlantic. Keeping the struggles separate might well give Germany the advantage against the British and the Soviets. In Moscow, Pearl Harbor came at a time when the tide of war with Germany seemed to be turning. Stalin's master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, had previously reported that the Japanese intended to strike against the Anglo-Americans and not the Soviet Union, and the attack vindicated Stalin's decision to move much of the Far Eastern Army west to deal with the Germans. Yet, Pearl Harbor triggered profound anxiety in the Kremlin. First, because it brought American pressure to declare war on Japan and thus plunge the Soviet Union into a two-front war after all. Second, because the new needs of the US armed forces and those of the embattled British Empire in Asia threatened to reduce the flow of vital military aid to the Soviet Union. The world, then, held its breath. The global sense of confusion and unpredictability after Pearl Harbor